It's a great pleasure to be with you. My mandate here, I guess, is to try and set the landscape for the next 2 days by giving you an insight into what's happening around the world. Now, as Eurasia Group, we're a firm of political scientists, and it's frankly quite odd to be standing up here as political folks telling you about the world. Because you would imagine that that would be the job for an economist, a macroeconomist. But actually, I think the state of the world that we're in today, it's perhaps not so odd for a political scientist to be talking to you about the state of the world, right? You only have to open any newspaper to think about the scale of political change that we're going through. Now, I have here with me just this morning's Australian, and the millennials in the room are wondering what this is, because, you know, a newspaper is a broken iPad to a millennial. And so just the headline here of US-China trade war warning. By the way, the second page had a story about a shark attack, and that confirmed every Australian stereotype to me as someone living in London. But you open this newspaper or you open the front page of the FT, and it's the same thing, right? The FT's motto is "We live in financial times." Actually, I think the motto should be "We live in political times." And so I'm here to make two simple assertions for you in the next 20 minutes. My first assertion is that the biggest influence on the global economy in the next 1 to 3 years is political, not economic. And my second assertion for you is that that very dynamic is a source of growth for KPMG. And I can say that confidently because our firms have an alliance together. We're out in the market advising clients where we as Eurasia Group are able to provide a political perspective on key business questions, and KPMG brings the breadth of its capabilities to help solve those. Now, your Australian government practice has been at the core of us being able to solve these problems for our clients together. We've together helped a government in the Middle East think very strategically about this. In the UK, our firms are working together with one of the world's biggest technology giants, helping them think through some of the political influences on technology. KPMG in Brazil is working with us to help develop a market entry project for a mining company looking to enter a new country in Africa. These are just some examples of how our firm's skill sets are helping companies navigate an increasingly troubled global landscape. So let me talk to you about some of the key forces that I think will shape the next 2 or 3 years. And I want to do this slight tour of the world. Rather than doing it on a country-by-country basis, I thought it would be valuable to do it on a sector basis. I know that your firm thinks deeply about sectors, so why don't we take a sector angle on everything that's happening around the world, and I think that'll give us a good sense of some of the issues our clients are grappling with. Now, the map that you see on both sides of the screen is Eurasia Group's view of the world over the next 6 months. So the colors, my colors are quite bright, red, yellow, and green. The kind of behavioral scientists in the design team said that these colors will be less threatening. So the sort of nice pastel colors mean the same thing. Pink is threatening, yellow is neutral, and the blue is kind of good. Now, I want to keep this map up here so that we can play a game over dinner or coffee where you point to your favorite country, or perhaps the country your client's doing a lot of work in, and say, why is that red or why is that green, right? We can do that later. But the reason I put it up here is because this is our view over the next 6 months of where politics is going to be good, bad, or neutral for the business environment, right? It's really key that I'm clear on this. This is not about whether politics is good, bad, or neutral, and not about whether it is today. It's about what the direction of travel is, and insofar as it relates to business activities. That's really the lens we're taking on this. So I leave this up here as food for thought because you might find some of these ratings quite striking, and we can talk about this as the day goes on. So I won't do the country view. Let me do a sector look. I'm going to take just 2 sectors that I know matter a lot to your firm. That's financial services and energy and natural resources, and take you through, I guess, some of the issues that I think are truly key over the next few months, right? But before I dive into the sector view, it would be remiss of me to not spend just a little bit of time on a global view, right? Just given what the headline today was. So let's spend a bit of time on the way we see the US-China conflict playing out, because that clearly determines a lot of the global trajectory and means a lot to you here in Australia. Now, the IMF meeting is happening in Bali this week, where the kind of reports that come out in advance have been clear. There is no doubt in the minds of the IMF economists, and frankly, in anyone who's been watching the global economy, that the US-China trade tension is negative for the global economy, right? We've downgraded our forecast of growth for the global economy from 3.9 to 3.7%. There's no doubt that that dynamic is negative for the US and China economies individually. And there's no doubt that it's negative for the Australian economy as well, because the IMF has downgraded the growth forecast in the Australian economy. So the big question then is, where are we headed? What is the likely glide path for this issue over the next few months, and what does it mean for you here in Australia? Well, our view is that you've got to see the US-China trade tension not just as a trade issue. You've got to see the US-China trade tension as a far bigger geopolitical battle between two powers. And when you start to think of it that way, you might change your forecast of what's going to happen in the future. Because frankly, on trade, our base case is that the tariffs currently in place stay in place, that on the 1st of January next year, the tariff rate from the United States goes up from 10% to 25%, and actually there's a decent likelihood that the remaining 267 billion of Chinese imports into the United States also get covered by tariffs. Not a good picture, right? Not a good picture, but that is our strong view of where we're headed. But when you start to think of it, not necessarily as just a trade question, but a question more about the relationship between two powers, I think you've got to come to the conclusion that trade is just one angle, and we haven't quite seen the full scale of the tension play out. The next area, I think, that we're going to be seeing far more tension between those two countries, where, frankly, firms like Australia, firms like companies operating in Australia, might end up as bycatch in that tension, is going to be on technology. We've seen hints of it. We've seen hints in the restrictions on 5G infrastructure in the United States, but I don't think we've seen the full impact of US restrictions on Chinese investment in the tech sector in the United States. So if you believe that, what does that actually then mean for the clients that you serve and the kinds of questions that they're going to have to answer? Well, let me give you some thoughts, right? I think the first thing it's going to mean is far greater stringency on investments both out of the United States as it relates to strategic technology, as well as into the United States. That will affect Chinese firms, no doubt, but it will also affect other firms, right? I think you're going to have to prepare for a much different way in which investment flows across borders. The second area I think you're going to see tension in is restrictions on STEM visas in the United States. Now, when STEM visas are restricted, it affects Chinese, it affects Indians, but it also affects a whole bunch of other countries for whom the availability and the movement of talent really matters. The third area I think is going to start to play out is far greater scrutiny on Chinese firms listing in the United States. And for the United States to be hauling up firms who don't meet the standards that the US deems necessary. That includes auditing standards. And so I think these are some of the ways in which this broad tension is going to play out in the minds of firms that do business across borders. The final thing I'll say on the US-China question, which I know again matters a lot to where we stand here today, is I think the recent skirmish we saw in the South China Sea just last week, which was a Chinese naval vessel and a United States vessel coming within 45 yards, is going to be another source of potential tension. Now, I don't expect direct military confrontation. We can have a discussion about what that might mean for shipping lanes and oil and gas concessions. But actually, one of the ways we've been thinking about the world, which that specific point really demonstrates, is that the main risk and the main source of shock in the global economy is probably an accident. Now, why do I say it's an accident? I say that because the balance of geopolitics in so many places, the South China Sea is one of them, Syria and Yemen is another, the balance of geopolitics in these regions is such that an unintended consequence of a seemingly benign act can lead and unleash a chain of events that I think will be the ultimate source of shock for the global economy. Right? So that's my sense at a macro level of where the US-China tension plays out in pretty meaningful ways, both in the short term as well as in the medium term. Let me now dive in, I think, into what I said were two interesting angles to look at the world from a sector point of view. Let's take financial services to start with. So if you're an Australian financial services player, what are you thinking about when you look out at the world? Well, when you look out at the United States, you're probably worried about where interest rates are going to go, right? That is top of mind about where interest rates in the United States are going to go. We've seen a period of interest rate hikes. You're probably going to see a further period of interest rate hikes all the way through into next year. The inversion of the yield curve, which many people think is the precursor to the recession, frankly, because it has been for each of the last 50 years where there has been a recession, I think is now a real possibility. When you read the outlook in the US, the fact that the fiscal stimulus was late cycle, the fact that this fiscal stimulus was poor quality, the fact that unemployment is at 40-year lows, I think all points to an increasing interest rate dynamic in the United States for the foreseeable future, right? Well, if you're looking to the United States, you're then thinking about the midterm elections. What happens in November? Well, I think it's pretty clear in November, well, we assign a high probability, an 80% probability, that Democrats will take back the House, but the Republicans will control the Senate, right? That's our view on what happens in the midterms US domestically. So what does that then mean for US domestic policy? Well, actually, I think that's a pretty good thing. I think aside from the things that Trump really cares about, Iran, Mexico, a few other issues, I actually think beyond those issues, Trump's pretty willing to make a deal with the Democrats. The question really is, can the extreme bipartisan nature in the United States actually allow us to come together to have deals on questions like immigration, where frankly Trump is far more likely to make a deal today than he was even 6 months ago. So I think we're in for a pretty tumultuous next 6 months as the Congress once again gets divided between Democrat and Republican in the House and the Senate, respectively. So if you're looking to the US, that's what you're thinking about. If you're looking to Europe, you're thinking about whether the European Central Bank has left it too late to start rising interest rates. Because perhaps we're post-peak, well, I'm pretty sure we're post-peak, and we're closer to the next recession than we are from the previous, right? And the European Central Bank has not been raising interest rates in a way that many people expected and felt that it should. Part of the reason for that is that you've got two major crises in Europe to think about, right? You've got Brexit and you've got Italy. Let's think about them for a second. Brexit is heading into possibly its most critical phase in the next 2 weeks. And that's not because the deadline's looming immediately, because the deadline, of course, is only in March when the UK formally leaves the European Union. But if in the next 2 weeks we don't have an agreement on the question of the Irish border, I think then the probability of a crash-out Brexit becomes more than 50%. And that's a pretty unbelievable scenario to be painting 6 months before the UK actually leaves the European Union. Currently, there is no parliamentary majority for any form of Brexit. If you think about that for a second, there is no parliamentary majority for any form of Brexit. And so for many firms, no deal planning is an absolute core part of strategy. And I know that KPMG in the UK has been helping many firms with that. So Brexit looms large as a big European issue that I think over the next 6 months will be pretty market negative and something that our clients will be thinking about. The other issue is Italy, right? Italy is in the most extraordinary circumstance of a far left and a far right government, right? And the combination of that far left and far right government is producing a fiscal situation that puts it at complete odds with the EU. Italy will be going for a budget deficit that is completely out of whack with EU fiscal rules. What that means is that the Commission has the possibility of taking the unprecedented step of not just vetoing the budget, but of essentially starting procedures against a country that has violated fiscal rules. I cannot overemphasize the impact, should that happen, that would have on financial markets, right? And I think the possibility of an extreme far-right coalition in Italy next year is now very real, because what you've seen is that the support for the far left, the five-star movement has fallen, and the support for the far right, which has significantly increased, which is the League. And I think you're looking at a scenario of elections next year where the League then joins up with Forza Italia to form an extreme far-right coalition. These are scenarios for Europe you would not have painted even just a year ago. And so I think if you're looking at Europe, our clients are trying to make sense of where this is all headed, and this is before we've even talked about things like Poland and Hungary. So if that's on the developed market side, let's just spend a minute on emerging markets. An environment of high interest rates and increasing interest rates in the United States, a strengthening dollar, doesn't do very good things for emerging markets that have high forex debt and are oil importers, right? And here you'd be really feeling for countries like India and Indonesia. Very similar circumstances, both heading into elections in 2019, both know that inflation is the #1 factor that will determine whether the current government stays in or out, and both are using precious fiscal reserves to prop up their currencies and prevent massive capital outflows. You should also be feeling for countries like Turkey and Argentina, although in one case, in Argentina's case, I think, it's a much better situation today than it was even 3 months ago. The renegotiated IMF package, the appointment of the new team have all been very market positive, and I expect that the two outcomes that we needed from Argentina, one was clarity on fiscal positions, and two was how the currency and monetary policy will behave, have been delivered through the IMF package. So I'm actually more comfortable in Argentina than I was even 3 months ago. Turkey is a totally different scenario, right? Turkey, I think, with the rate of inflation, with the rate of foreign debt, and looking ahead at the 2019 elections, I think things in Turkey are going to get far more tumultuous before they get better. And that's to say nothing of whether the Idlib situation continues to hold, and if it does, what that does to Turkey's position in the region. So I think emerging markets are starting to feel the pressure of a high interest rate and a strengthening US dollar environment. And what we've seen from the way our clients have been engaging us is being able to explain and think about these issues in ways that perhaps they haven't thought about because you haven't considered some of the political drivers, is starting to become a way to get leverage over these issues. So if you're a financial services client, that's what you're probably thinking about. If you're in the energy and natural resources sector, you're probably thinking about some other questions, all of which have very interesting political dimensions too. Let's take the oil and gas sector to start with. So if you're in the oil and gas sector and you're thinking about oil demand, you're probably looking at what India, Turkey, and China are going to do on the demand for oil from Iran, right? And so we have a very clear sense that India will continue to draw down oil purchases from Iran because the India-US bilateral relationship is the most important thing to Modi right now. We think that China will continue to draw down on oil demand from Iran, but not as much because they'll secure a waiver from the United States, and we've seen that because oil has been kept out of any of the tariff negotiations. Turkey is the one country where you don't expect any drawdown in oil demand, especially because they've been leaning much more towards Russia than they have been to the United States, which is a pretty crazy scenario when you think about the fact that Turkey and the United States are both NATO members. So if you're thinking about oil demand, those are some of the political dynamics you're watching. If you're thinking about oil supply, you're clearly watching Iran. I think Iran, by November, will take 1.2 million barrels per day off the market, right? I think that's the level you're getting to when the full force of the US sanctions take effect. You're thinking about Saudi and Russia as oil producers who seem to have stitched up a behind-the-scenes deal outside of the OPEC regime to ensure that oil prices stay relatively low coming into the midterm elections. You're thinking about Venezuela, where oil production is declining at 50,000 barrels per day per month, with no signs of that actually improving. You're thinking about Angola, which happens to be one of the bright spots, and it's one of the only countries that's green on the map. You're thinking about Angola because as Lourenço has consolidated his grip on power, he's been able to push forward reforms that allow the Angolan oil sector to not just thrive domestically, but become more attractive again for foreign investors. So if you're thinking about oil, and sorry, that's not to say anything about Mexico, where AMLO, as he's known, López Obrador, the new president, has followed through on all of his promises that he would do on the Mexican energy sector, including significantly increasing local refining capacity and the role of Pemex. And that's, you can understand that when you start to understand AMLO's overall agenda. So if you're thinking about oil demand and supply, that's what you're thinking about. If you're thinking about LNG, on the other hand, which again is absolutely critical, I know, to the market here, you're thinking about a slightly different set of issues. If you're thinking about LNG, you're probably thinking about Qatar, because Qatar is the lowest cost producer and the one to beat on LNG. And Qatar has just been all over Latin America signing deals for LNG contracts with Argentina, with Ecuador, with Peru. And you're thinking about the supply that's going to need to come on stream post-2020 when the current projects start to deliver what they're meant to deliver. You're probably thinking about Canada, where on the one hand, there's been challenges on the oil sands production with the Trans Mountain Pipeline, but on the other hand, the fact that the Shell LNG project has been seen through thanks to government sweeteners means that Western Canada is back on the map as a result on the LNG circuit. But you probably care a lot about how much political capital Justin Trudeau has invested both in the Trans Mountain Pipeline, but also in the carbon tax. And the carbon tax, of course, you've seen, it has recently come into opposition in a number of states. And so when you start to think about Justin Trudeau's position to be able to see some of those reforms through, you get a much better picture of the Canadian energy supply market and where it might land. I referenced the South China Sea, and clearly there's a lot to think about there if you're thinking about LNG and oil and gas. For all intents and purposes, the way we think about the South China Sea is the way you might have thought about the United States thinking about the Caribbean Sea 40 years ago. And I think, if you're looking for parallels for how accidents, as I mentioned before, could turn into really difficult situations for the oil and gas markets in the South China Sea, you only have to look back at the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. You only have to look back at the fighter jet issue with China in 2001 to know that when an accident like this can happen, it can set forth a chain of reactions that can really disrupt global supply chains, such as those that exist in oil and gas. We haven't even talked about Iran, for example, misbehaving in a way that might close the Strait of Hormuz to oil supply, which is something that I know our firms together have been helping one of our clients think through. So that's a very quick sense of the kinds of issues that I think if you were sitting here helping your clients in the oil and gas sector, in the financial services sector, think through what you might be worried about. Let me end on, I guess, maybe a slightly more positive note, because I know some of this has been pretty depressing stuff. The reason I say let me end on a slightly positive note is because in amongst all of this, and in amongst a much derided move towards populism, I think if you start to look very closely, there are parts of the world where even if you may not agree with the political orientation, as advisors to clients, we should feel pretty good. Philippines is one good example here. I'm not taking a moral view on whether Duterte's style of governance is good or bad. I'm simply saying that the way I read Philippines, the fact that his health scare is not as bad as we thought it was, and the fact that constitutional reform is likely to pass, but without a change in the line of succession, which is what he wanted to do, you're looking at a country with a lot of political stability over the next few years. That's a good thing. You're seeing an extreme populist leader in Duterte not interfering with the work of his technocians. That's a good thing. Right? When you start to look at a situation like Brazil, for my money, the most divided and fractious political situation you could have anywhere. Brazilian politics makes American politics look sane in some cases. Even so, the market reaction to Bolsonaro's first-round performance has been positive. Now, Bolsonaro is an extremely divisive character, but when you start to think about his impacts on the market, you can start to feel pretty good. I would feel pretty good about Modi in India. Again, not because I'm making a judgment on Modi's politics, but because it sets in motion and continues a path on India's development that I think is very, very positive. Sure, there are issues on Hindu nationalism in India, but I'm not making a moral judgment. I'm simply saying that in many parts of the world, as we look to the rise of populism, I know in the KPMG CEO survey, the rise of territorialism was ranked as the #1 risk. As we think about these broader themes, looking just beneath the surface to understand what they mean in terms of economic conditions that our clients operate in is a pretty useful exercise. And I'm really pleased that our firms are working together to do this. And I know over the next week, I'll be seeing a number of your clients, both here as well as in Sydney and Melbourne, to talk through some of these issues in detail. So I hope that gives you a sense, I guess, of how we see the world. I look forward to discussing many of these issues with you over the next day or so. And I believe we have some time for questions now. So I'm told I have these things to throw at you, which allow you to then ask a question, which is a nice change, because normally I have things thrown at me, eggs and rotten tomatoes after a session. So this is pretty soft. It doesn't hurt.
Okay, so.
There you go.
Is there a mic in this? Oh my God. Okay. So you talked about oil. You talked about LNG. What about renewables? What is your view on how the geopolitics of energy is changing across the world with regards to decarbonization? Which countries are likely to benefit economically over the next 10 years as a result of dealing with energy decarbonization and energy transition?
It's a wonderful question, but a painful question given the events of the last week with the release of the IPCC report, which of course, for those who haven't been following very closely, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change releases a report every so many years that then talks about the rate of decarbonization we would need to achieve in order to meet sensible goals of temperature increase. I know in Australia that's been a very fractious debate with the views of the Environment Minister. And as I said, in Canada, I think the proposals for a minimum carbon levy have run into significant political challenges. I think it's 4 states now that have essentially vetoed the implementation of the carbon levy, and Justin Trudeau's invested significant political capital in them. I say that because I actually think these 2 developments represent for me the reversal of 2 or 3 years of momentum built towards a framework that promotes renewable energy investments. Now, if I just think about the economics behind renewable energy, I feel really great. When I start to think about the politics behind renewable energy, I feel less great. So I think about the countries that stand to benefit and where we're headed. I feel really good about France, right? I feel really good about France, not least, well, in July, the environment minister resigned because he believed that France wasn't moving quickly enough. But when I look around the world, I'm really excited about what's happening in France in support for renewable energy. Right? Macron has gone as far as to say that if the United States is putting into its trade deals, and you know this, right, because the USMCA, the new NAFTA deal, has a provision that says those countries need to inform the US before they do a deal with China as a non-state economy, Macron has said, okay, if you do a deal with us, you can't do a deal with us if you're not part of the Paris Climate Accord, right? That's pretty bold. That's pretty bold. So I feel excited about what's happening in France. I feel really excited about some of the stuff happening in North Africa on solar. And that's both on CSP, concentrated solar power, as well as on PV. I think utility scale CSP and PV is really exciting. I tell you, and this is my final thought on it, the region I can't fully get my head on is in Southeast Asia. Because I actually think in Southeast Asia, renewables face an interesting picture in relation to gas. In one scenario, you might say the future of Southeast Asia is coal and renewables, and gas gets squeezed. And I think that's my picture. I think in Southeast Asia, renewables will actually benefit at the expense of gas, which is unusual because in many places, gas and renewables are matching up against each other. But I think, personally, one of the CEOs that we work with asked us this question, and I think this is pertinent to what you just asked. They said, what is the next plastic? What is the next issue that we kind of thought was simmering for a long time, but suddenly became a really big issue? And I think policy around carbon and renewables is going to be the next plastic in the next 12 to 18 months. I think this is a really critical period. Who else can I throw something at?
Corner. Oh, I'm not sure. Okay, it's on. Great, thanks for a very thought-provoking presentation. I was fascinated with the article that you showed us in The Australian. The headlines were, "Prepare for a Beijing Student Blockade." Now, I'm very interested in your views on how much of a threat that is, because Education is exceptionally important for Australia, being the 4th largest sector. In fact, Australia has more foreign students than any other country in the world, apart from the US, and we are the 56th largest country in the world by population. Thank you.
It's a great question, and that article, of course, went on to say that India and Indonesia will be 2 sources of student inflows should Beijing restrict the number of students coming in. You know, my sense is that it isn't, and all the reads that we have on Chinese policy, this isn't anywhere close to the top priority or part of the arsenal to use on China's part. You know, I think this is, in many cases, media noise that isn't really grounded in what I think are the priorities for the Chinese leadership. And let me tell you why. Because the things that really matter, number one, are the restrictions in STEM visas in the United States. That's a very credible threat, and I think that's something that Beijing is looking to respond to. If anything, that actually increases the impetus for Chinese students to be seeking alternative destinations to the United States. The next thing that matters, I think, is the restrictions on the H-1B visa in the US. Again, it's a visa issue, but it really, really matters. I don't see the restrictions on H-1B lifting anytime soon either. When you think about other markets that are competing for Chinese students, and you think about the United Kingdom, it's far from the first choice for many, many people right now, not just because of the uncertainty around Brexit, but because of, frankly, very unfriendly immigration regulations. So both in terms of market forces, as well as our read on Chinese politics, we're not very concerned that this is something that really plays out at least over the next 12 to 18 months. I think we probably have time for one more question. Right here in the front. Ooh, a little passeroo.
Hi, hello. Rohitesh, thanks very much. I was interested in the colour scheme, and Australia looked to be a little bit grey, which we don't think we are. But understanding that the world is incredibly connected now, and you've gone around the world. But what is your view on Australia, given our trade relationships with Asia and the United States, and the outlook?
It's a great question. I neglected to mention that grey on the map are countries that we don't track on a regular basis. And that in itself says a lot. You see, that in itself says a lot, because I know that the revolving door to the Prime Minister's office is spinning pretty quickly here, right? And there are a range of domestic political issues that really matter. But from our point of view, certainly from where we sit, and the questions that our 400 clients ask us, half of whom are big businesses, half of whom are asset managers, Australia rarely figures in the questions that they're concerned about. And that's because when you start to, the way we think about countries, and I'll give you my short view on Australian domestic politics in a second, but it's worth just painting the picture. We think about countries in terms of social stability, in terms of economy, in terms of government capacity. And frankly, on all 3 measures, the fact that Australia is in its 28th year without a recession, aside from musical chairs with the Prime Minister's role, generally pretty stable environment, and socially too, when you compare it to some of the other countries, certainly on our indices ranks pretty high, it's actually not a country that many investors think deeply politically about, other than specific domestic questions. Now, I won't venture into where I think domestic politics in Australia is headed, because I actually think there's people in the room that are much more qualified to speak about it. But I will say that the potential for Australia to play an important role in future trade dynamics is fundamental. And that's not just because of the resources question, but something like the UK joining the expanded Trans-Pacific Partnership, for me, is just one example of how I think connections to this part of the world are only set to increase. And if I look out over the next 1 to 3 years about the range of domestic political risks I've talked about, and the ones I didn't even talk about, for example, we didn't even talk about sub-Saharan Africa, which has a fundamental and interesting connection to Australia through the resources sector. I frankly don't see Australia ranking very high on any measure of political risk. Thanks very much, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.